Well, hello and welcome to Musings of a Texas Preacher Man. I'm Scott Fisher and I'm glad you've chosen to study with me today. Today we're continuing our study of the new heavens and new earth and bring to a close another week of study. Now this week we shifted our focus to the phrase heavens and earth, which took us to the very first biblical reference of the heavens and the earth in the very first verse of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 10, which has served kind of as our source text, Peter wrote the following: "But the day of the Lord will come like a thief, in which the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the elements will be destroyed with intense heat, and the earth and its works will be burned up." Now this verse and the next few verses has become the primary source for those who advocate a yet in our future destruction of the heavens and the earth. Now I've taken the position that Peter used apocalyptic language utilized by the Old Testament prophets, language that was never intended to be interpreted literally. So if that's true, and I obviously think it is, what could Peter have been talking about? We've seen that in the Old Testament, God used this kind of language to portray the downfall of governments, of nations, such as Babylon, Egypt, Assyria, Greece, even Israel. Now that is the biblical and historical record. Jesus, Peter, James, John, and Paul all use this language to speak of something that was going to take place in their not too distant future. In the same way that in the Old Testament, God described his judgment with apocalyptic terms, utilizing the armies of pagan nations to execute his judgment, the New Testament writers are doing the same thing. God was going to raise up the army of Rome and its international mercenaries to execute his judgment on Israel with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. It was going to happen in the generation of the apostles. Jesus said, "Truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." That's Matthew 16:28. Now, just several questions. Was Jesus mistaken? There's some scholars and pastors that believe Jesus was mistaken. Did he intentionally mislead his disciples? There are some scholars and pastors who teach and believe that Jesus intentionally misled his disciples. Or the third, did it happen just as he said it would? Well, I think that's the only legitimate stance. I don't believe Jesus would mislead. I don't think he would be mistaken. He knew everything. Think about this statement. Some say that he was speaking here of the transfiguration that would take place in just a few days. In fact, in Matthew, we just quoted chapter 16, the transfiguration's in Matthew chapter 17. But that makes no sense at all. If I'm talking to a group of people and referring to an event I expect to occur in a matter of days or weeks, I'm not going to say, some of you will live to see this take place. No, the expectation is that they will all see it take place. It would be a rare exception for someone to not live to see something in the next few days or weeks. But if I'm speaking of something decades in the future, as in from 30 AD to 70 AD, some would live to see it. Some of the hearers who were listening to what Jesus had to say, some of them alive in 30 AD would still be alive in 70 AD. Not many, probably, but some. In Matthew 23, a chapter filled with Jesus' rebuke of the first century Jewish leadership, Jesus makes clear that the judgment of God is going to come on that generation. Verse 31, "So you testify against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how will you escape the sentence of hell? Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Now, notice again, Jesus is saying to them, I'm sending these people to you. And some of them you will kill and crucify. And some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Now look at verse 36. Truly I say to you, these first century Jewish leaders, truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Now clearly, Jesus is speaking of a judgment that was going to come upon the people he was speaking to. He's not talking about something thousands of years out into the future. This judgment would bring about the end of the Old Covenant age and the full realization of the Messianic kingdom. So here's a question to consider. And you got to think about this. When did the Old Covenant end and the New Covenant begin? Now you would think that would be a very simple question with a simple answer, but it's not. Some Christians immediately respond with, at the cross. But Jesus made the following statement. Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I say to you, now get ready, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law until all is accomplished. That's Matthew 5:17 and 18. So wait a minute. Not the smallest letter of the law will pass away until heaven and earth pass away? So does that mean we're still living under the law of Moses? Heaven and earth have not yet passed away, have they? At the preaching of John the Baptist, and then the preaching of Jesus himself, the central message was that the kingdom of heaven, and they use several terms, is at hand, is in your midst, it's within you, it's near, phrases like that. If the old covenant passed away at the cross, why were there still major disagreements over circumcision, dietary laws, Sabbath day observance, ceremonial washings, etc., still taking place 25 to 35 years after the crucifixion and the resurrection? There was a transition period that took an entire generation to be accomplished. And Scripture clearly addresses this. In 2 Corinthians chapter 3, written about 55 AD, so assuming the crucifixion was in 30 AD, 25 years after the crucifixion and the resurrection, Paul wrote the following, beginning at verse 7. But if the ministry of death in letters engraved on stones, the law of Moses, came with glory, so that the sons of Israel could not look intently at the face of Moses because of the glory of his face, fading as it was, how will the ministry of the Spirit, the new covenant, fail to be even more with glory? For if the ministry of condemnation has glory, much more does the ministry of righteousness abound in glory. For indeed, what had glory, in this case, has no glory because of the glory. Now look at this phrase, the glory that surpasses it. For if that which fades away was with glory, much more that which remains is in glory. Now, this is problematic for many. 25 years after the crucifixion, the glory of the law is fading away. Present tense, not past tense. In Hebrews, a book that's explaining this transition from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant, comparing and contrasting the two covenants, written around 62 to 65 AD, so 32 to 35 years after the crucifixion and resurrection, the writer makes the exact same point. Verse 13, when he said a new covenant, he made the first obsolete. But whatever is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to disappear. Now again, notice, 32 to 35 years after the crucifixion and resurrection, the old covenant is becoming obsolete and growing old and is ready to disappear. It has not yet, at the time this verse was written, it had not yet disappeared, but it was about to. So back to Jesus' statement from Matthew chapter 5. Until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass away from the law until all has been accomplished. So, is the law of Moses still in force today? Are we subject to the dietary laws, the laws of circumcision, the laws of the Sabbath, etc.? No way. So when did heaven and earth pass away? At the cross? Well, obviously not, because 35 years later they're still talking about the passing away of the old covenant, the fading of the old covenant, the becoming obsolete of the old covenant. The only logical answer is that it happened just as Jesus said it would, exactly when he said it would, in the generation of his first disciples and followers. The destruction of heaven and earth, a symbolic term, an apocalyptic phrase used to describe the 70 AD destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Well, I hope you're tracking with me and working through the issues we're discussing and wrestling with the scriptures. On the closing screen of the video, you'll see my email address, my Twitter handle, my Facebook page. Feel free to communicate with me. Ask questions. What are you struggling with? Let's interact. And Monday we'll pick up right here and continue looking at the new heavens and new earth and how it unfolds in Scripture. So I invite you to stick with me. I know that if you've never considered what I'm sharing, it may be shocking to you. It's a lot to chew on. I understand that. I know that. I've been chewing on it and wrestling with it myself. Carefully study the Scriptures and allow Scripture to interpret Scripture. And we're going to continue searching out the truth. And if you haven't looked at the previous videos, understand this series builds on the previous lessons, so be sure to check them out. Take the weekend and catch up on some of the previous videos. If you're willing to study, if you're willing to ask questions, if your desire is to know the truth, to learn what the Bible actually says, then I invite you to join me right here on Musings of a Texas Preacher Man. I post a teaching 4 times each week on Monday through Thursday. I'll post a link on Facebook and Twitter, and if you click the subscribe button in the lower right corner of your screen, you'll be notified whenever I post a new video. Well, I hope you'll go out and make today a great day. Be safe, be blessed, have a great weekend, and don't forget Sunday is Mother's Day, and then join me right here again on Monday.